Recording. So our schedule is that I'm going to talk about the Jewish calendar and Passover for the first 45 minutes or so. And then we'll have our guests who'll talk about one particular element of Passover, the Maxwell House Haggadah, which has a fascinating story. And so it'll probably tie into some of the things I'm going to say. As I say, the caveat I say before each of these classes is there ain't no way you're going to really cover this topic in 45 minutes. You know, an hour would not have been enough, 45 minutes for sure. But because we don't have another session specifically devoted to the Jewish calendar, I do want to at least give you a little bit of background information. And just know that you will have questions no matter what your level of expertise, and that's okay, because that's what Passover is all about, asking questions and maybe occasionally getting answers. So let me start, and hope you enjoy the background here. So Jewish calendar is fascinating. I mean, all calendars are fascinating, but you can tell a lot about the philosophy of a group, of a religion, of a faith group, whatever, of a tradition, of any culture from its calendar. Certain aspects of the calendar tell you a lot. One thing is where it starts. You know, the year, for instance, in the the year 2023 would be connected to the Christian, or now sort of secular calendar, but the Western Christian calendar, which goes back to ostensibly the birth of Jesus. The Muslim calendar goes back throughout Muslim history to its beginnings with Muhammad. Most calendars do that. The Jewish calendar is one that does not. If we look at our year, we are, and every Rosh Hashanah we say this is the birthday of the world. We are that number of years, now approaching 6,000, from creation. Now, we won't get into the scientific question of whether creation really was 6,000 years ago. And no, as we discussed in our first and second sessions, really, we are not literalists. At least progressive Jews are not, and many Orthodox Jews are not as well. We don't take this literally, but that amount of time probably can at least trace us back to the beginnings of civilization, or at least Mesopotamian civilization and writing and other kinds of communication, things, city-states, things that happened around them. That's interesting. But what's more interesting for the purpose of this discussion is that the calendar, in saying that it dates back to the beginning of the universe, to the creation, is making a very important statement, and that is that Judaism sees itself as being tied into, connected to all civilizations. And in effect, since we came into being 4,000 years ago, give or take, the Jewish people, Jewish culture, Jewish civilization, we have been throughout the world. We've been connected to all. So it makes sense then that our calendar very much is what one could call a compromise calendar, or at least a synthesis calendar, or a calendar that can connect us to different kinds of peoples and cultures. So one question that you ask when you're talking about a calendar is it a cyclical calendar or a linear calendar? Does time move in circles, or does time head in a straight line and is heading towards some ultimate end? Judaism tends to, especially as it developed post-biblically, tends to be more linear, in that we're looking at history having a beginning and an end. That end will be, in Jewish belief, messianic, but we are not going to talk about Messiah too much tonight. We're going to get to that in another session. So, but there are elements that are cyclical. Seasons are cyclical. So along the same lines, I'm going to sort of cut to the chase here. The Jewish calendar wants us to celebrate seasons that come around every year, cyclically, and to connect our holidays to those seasons. So Passover, which is coming up next week always occurs in the spring. It is the quintessential spring holiday. Its month is the spring month. Aviv in Hebrew means spring. It's called in the Bible the month of the spring. So Passover has to be then, and there's that sense of time going in circles, cyclically, with the rhythms of nature, and in specific, the rhythms of the earth going around the sun, 365 and a quarter, give or take, days for a year. So we align ourselves, the Jewish calendar aligns itself to that sense of cyclical time. At the same time, we're also moving forward in history, and we'll talk about Passover not only as a holiday that celebrates nature and spring, but also celebrates a key historical event in Jewish history, the liberation from slavery in Egypt, and it is our birthday, our birth holiday as a people. So the Jewish people came into being on Passover, and it is literally exactly half a year from another new year, which became the new year after the destruction of the Second Temple. That's Rosh Hashanah, of course, and we call that the birthday of the world. So we have the birthday of the Jewish people and the birthday of the world half a year apart. And it's a fascinating symmetry and a balance between sort of this historical and biblical and mythical and cyclical, rather. Okay, so that's important to note. But also there's another cycle. Some cultures, some civilizations have their calendars based on the orbit of the Earth around the sun, of course, the solar year, and some have lunar calendars, like, for instance, the Muslim calendar. Ramadan has started. Ramadan will always move around. It moves about a month or a little less than a month every year, because the Muslim calendar is very clearly tied to the lunar calendar. Jewish holidays also are connected to the lunar calendar because a Jewish month is totally based on that. A Jewish month, literally month, moon, the word even is the same, but a Jewish month begins when a new moon is sighted. So that's 29 and a half days, give or take. Some Jewish months are 29 days, some Jewish months are 30 days, and so on. So we have this interesting juxtaposition of the solar calendar and the lunar calendar. The lunar calendar, if you go 12 months of 29 and a half days, basically, I'm not a mathematician, but 354 days for a lunar year. 365 and a quarter for a solar year. So every year we lose 11 days by having this combined calendar. And that's when I talk about Jewish calendars being sort of a compromise. We want to be the rhythms of the seasons. We want to be tied to nature, but also to be lifted above and beyond the seasons, as the Muslim calendar is, and have events be much more tied to this linear view of history. So in the end, the rabbis were great mathematicians and astronomers, were able to figure out the exact formula to keep Passover in the spring. And I'm just, I'm not going to get into the details, but let's just say that seven times every 19 years, we add a month. 7 times every 19 years, we add a 29 or 30-day month, which we tack on to the end of the year. So the last month of the biblical year is Adar, where we were in it, and this was not a leap year on the Jewish calendar. And the first month is Nisan, which is what we're now in, the month that we're now in. So that works out so that, and you'll notice, like if you had a yahrzeit or whatever, 19 years from now, this month, if you had, it will be on the exact same day of the secular. It'll sort of align once again. You have this incredibly complicated but fascinating pattern that allows this to happen. So that is sort of the quick lecture on this stuff, but I want to show you if I can. Okay, this is not what you want to see. This is. So anyway, this is the Jewish calendar, and all of these are the 12 months of the Jewish year, and they're all basically connected to their seasons. It isn't exact. They knew that it wasn't exact. So there actually is a scenario where in 10,000 years, Passover will occur in June. Any of us who are around will have to deal with it. But I have a feeling not too many of us will be here. But the fact that that happens just says it's not perfect. And the way the rabbis resolved this in the Talmudic period is to say, well, this is one of those things that we hope the Messiah will come by 10,000 years from now, and the Messiah will take care of it. So anyway, just to go through the months, and this is really what the 101 beginners class should cover. Everything else was just like a little philosophical academic background, but just so you'd understand the calendar. All right, so Nisan is the month we're in. This is a very important month. It is not the first month of the year. Biblically, it was. Rosh Hashanah, Tishrei became the first month, as I said, in post-biblical times. Passover, Yom HaShoah, very important holidays, the spring cycle of holidays. Then you have Iyar, Yom HaZikaron, Israel's Independence Day, Lag BaOmer. I won't get into the Omer right now, but that's a whole sort of sub-calendar to the calendar. It's a period between Passover and this holiday in Sivan, Shavuot, which is the second of the 3 pilgrimage festivals. Passover is the first, pilgrimage to Jerusalem, I should say. Shavuot is the second. Each is tied to a historical event and to an agricultural event. Again, this sort of synthesis of nature and history, of the cyclical time that nature symbolizes, and the historical progression, the linear time. So Passover celebrates, of course, coming out of Egypt. The agricultural element that it celebrates is the barley harvest. Shavuot, now the rainy period is over in the land of Israel, but the wheat continues to grow. And in June or so, May or June, you have this second pilgrimage festival, which celebrates the wheat harvest. Shavuot's historical element is the receiving of the Torah, actually the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. That isn't mentioned in the Torah at all, that it's tied to Shavuot. Of course, the Torah is presented in the Torah. You see it. You see the description of it in the book of Exodus at Mount Sinai. But Shavuot, the connection to Shavuot came in post-biblical times. It was another incredible innovation of the rabbis, who were, as I mentioned last week, very creative in reestablishing and reinventing Judaism. So that's May or June. You get into the summer. Not too much going on in the summer because they knew that rabbis tend to take vacations in the summer. So we have the commemoration of the destruction of the temple, Tisha B'Av, both temples, and a lot of other disasters. That's in the month of Av, July or August. And for those who have been to Jewish camps, overnight camps, this is the only holiday you get during the camp season. It's a fast day when it's 90 degrees and hot and terrible and muggy, and it's depressing. So many decide to observe Hanukkah in July, or do something else. But Tisha B'Av people know about it in part because of camps. Elul is the last month of the year, leading up to the grand holiday month of Tishrei. Includes Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, the high holidays, the third pilgrimage festival of Sukkot, the harvest for grapes, and generally speaking, it's an autumnal harvest festival, a Thanksgiving type festival. Our Thanksgiving was modeled after it. And Simchat Torah, again, another rabbinic innovation from Talmudic times, because, and this is another thing I don't dare venture into, but because of the uncertainty of when the new moon actually began, the rabbis ordained that we add one day to major Jewish festivals. So the added on day to Sukkot is, had no other purpose. So they slapped an interesting concept of finishing the Torah and beginning the cycle of reading it once again, Simchat Torah. So we have those major Tishrei holidays, and they all come together. It's really a whole month where nothing gets done in Israel, and where rabbis and cantors work a lot. Cheshvan, no holidays, and then Kislev, Hanukkah, and then we get into the winter, Tevet, Shavat, and then Adar, Tu B'Shvat, Festival of Trees, and Purim. So I'm going to pause here for a second to see if there are any questions. Okay, so that's good to know. We're going to now move on to Passover. Did I actually do like the whole calendar in 20 minutes? That's one of the things with Passover. They have Seders in 20 minutes, right? You have the 20-minute Seder. So I'm going to do the whole holiday in 20 minutes too. All right, so let's go back. I just want to share one other thing that sort of transitions us. These are the days when Passover fell for the decade that ended last year. And I just wanted to give you a sense. Now, this isn't the entire 19-year cycle, but a good slice of it. And you can see the range of dates that Passover would begin as early as March 25th in 2013 and as late as April 22nd in 2016, which of course an 8-day festival, 7 in the land of Israel, but 8 days in the diaspora. So it would end almost in May, April 30th. It is and it isn't connected to the timing of Easter, which also has connections to the moon, the spring moon, the Paschal moon. But sometimes it'll be a month apart. Sometimes Passover, sometimes Easter will come on when Purim comes. It's fascinating when that happens. But also, like this year, very often they do coincide that the Christian Holy Week occurs at the same time as our week of Passover. Anyway, so we're sort of in the middle this year. It's not listed here, but Passover is, April 6th or so. It is somewhat on the early side, but definitely within range of what would normally be the holiday. This is a perfect example of why people say, the expression is, all our holidays are either early or late. They never come on time. Well, they actually do come on time. They come on time if you're living on Jewish time. And one of my crusades, and I have to say that was the first article I ever wrote for the New York Jewish Week in 1990s, was about this. If we set our clocks to Jewish time, it's never early or late. Yeah, our meetings will always be 10 minutes late, but what can you do? By the way, Lutherans also say that they call that Lutheran time, that meetings start 10 minutes, 15 minutes late, just like Jewish meetings do. But if we get attuned to that rhythm, it changes our whole outlook on life. It changes our whole perspective. Being Jewish is much more organic. If we see the week according to the rhythm that begins with the end of Shabbat and ends with the beginning of the next Shabbat, that Shabbat becomes the center point to that week. And if we're talking about Jewish calendar, week to week, day to day, Jewish days are called the first day. Yom Rishon is Sunday, the first day of the following Shabbat, first day leading to Shabbat, Yom Rishon l'Shabbat, Yom Sheni l'Shabbat. So living on Jewish time means that nothing ever comes early or late, but you sense a real rhythm. You also can look up at the sky, and if you see a full moon, you know it's the middle of the month. You never know that for February, March, or April, but you do know that for Adar, Nisan, and Iyar. You look up at the sky, and you see Oh, full moon. Wow. When you look up at the sky next week, you'll know it's the first night of Pesach. And you can imagine the children of Israel doing this, what's behind me right here, in front of a full moon, under a full moon. Actually, it was a little, 7 days in. So it wasn't the day of the actual Exodus, but still, there was a pretty big moon. All right, that's the Jewish calendar. Now, we're going to move on and talk about Pesach. And actually, I'll go here. So I have a guide that I'm going to share with you. Hold on. Put into the chat. Good to see everyone who's come aboard. Welcome. All right, so this is a guide you can use. I'll just show it to you briefly, but I don't want to rely on it on the screen because I think it's a little small to read for all of you. But I can make it a little bigger, actually. This is my guide for the perplexed, for Passover preparations, which we are now heavily into. So let me start by asking the question, what is chametz? And chametz relates to the 5 species of grain: wheat, barley, spelt, rye, and oats. And they have been subjected to a leavening process. In their unleavened states, these 5 grains can be used to make matzah. So you see wheat matzah, barley, spelt, rye. It's not the grains themselves that are chametz. Chametz is just the concept of something that is prohibited on Passover, considered leavened. But I don't want you to think of it just purely as having risen, like, throw in some yeast and it rises. No, chametz really means fermenting more than rising, fermenting or souring. So, dough can rise just by letting it sit out. Of course, also a leavening agent can be added. Chametz includes not only bread, crackers, macaroni, but items formed of fermented grain used in other ways, like beer, whiskey, grain, vinegar. The elaborate koshering process, koshering means setting in its proper way, literally its fitting way, cleaning, involves putting away regular foods and dishes, renouncing ownership of leaven, and buying special foods. And they're all steps to ensure that no chametz will be found in places where it might be used, that you won't gain any benefit from chametz. Any presence of chametz, however minute, is forbidden on Passover. And what I'm going to describe here are the traditional norms having to do with Pesach. A lot of people who are not that observant in their everyday lives tend to be more observant about Passover, just because there's a real pull to these traditions. These traditions pull us back. It's a definite recharging of the Jewish batteries. And I'm fine with inconsistencies. I often talk about, we call it the kosher pig syndrome, where people will be so lax in some ways, but when it comes to Passover, no chametz. No, legumes, I'm never going to eat it. All right, I'll talk about legumes in a second. So anyway, important stuff. Questions? No questions. Okay. I'm going to move on. All right, so what does this koshering process involve? Well, part of it is just cleaning, but part of it is also, I'm going to have my car cleaned. I always do that. I don't go to a car wash that often, but before Pesach, I want to do that, because places where you tend to be, it doesn't mean you have to do it. It doesn't mean you have to clean every crevice of your house. Kitchen, sure, but, there are rooms that never see food. But it's a sense of spring cleaning. It's a sense of transitioning, of as we do on the high holidays with our souls, soul searching, cheshbon hanefesh, we do with our bodies on Pesach, which is also a form of soul searching. So there's something to be said for this process, even if it seems at times excessive. And I will not doubt that at all. For instance, yes, chametz is forbidden because we want, chametz is this sense of inflated souls and inflated egos that we want to flatten. We want to get ourselves back to our more natural state in that sense. So the food that is chametz is forbidden. But if you buy it before the holiday begins, then if it's less than 1/60th of the whole mixture, it can be okay. So in this packet that I just linked to, you'll be able to see some of the things that you can get that even if it doesn't say kosher for Passover on it, it's okay. But again, of course, it's always a matter of your own tastes, your own, halachic Jewish legal priorities. All right, so what about legumes? Let's quickly mention this. There are other grains like rice, millet, corn, peas, beans that aren't mentioned in the ones that I said before, and they're called kitniot. So when we call it legumes, it's not just like, soybeans. It's things that we might not consider legumes, like corn. And they are not chametz. And Sephardic Jews, meaning Jews who are from Arab countries, from North Africa, from the Middle East, the majority from Israel are Sephardic Jews, and they generally they're generally a little bit less stringent in their interpretations of Jewish law over the years, the centuries that sort of developed, but they also tend to allow for kitniot, whereas European Jews, Ashkenazim, follow the custom of prohibiting these items. That is changing. The idea of prohibiting them has nothing to do with the items themselves, but it's that it looks like a grain that might be forbidden, and we might make a mistake, or some rice might get mixed into some forbidden mixture, and it's putting a fence around the Torah, as they said in Pirkei Avot, in Ethics of the Fathers. Talked a little about that last week. So the fence means we're not just going to obey the letter of the law, but we're going to go beyond it to make sure that we don't obey the letter of the law. We build a fence beyond it. Same reasoning is used for lighting Shabbat candles and holiday candles before sunset, even though the holiday actually begins at sunset. Okay, so my personal, if you want to get into a discussion over kitniyot, it would be great, but I don't think we have the time to tonight. But I have often just suggested that people should follow the dictum of Shalom Bayit. If you have in your family or guests at your Seder people who are Sephardic Jews and you don't feel that strongly about it, you might want to follow their custom, or if you're going to their home. On the other hand, you want to be sensitive to those who might have a more stringent approach. Either way, it's a great cause for a discussion and a conversation. And so, all right, I'm going to move on. So anyway, when do we start eating matzah? We can eat matzah all year, but some people, and it actually is sort of a general custom, to avoid it on the day before the Seder so that it'll be fresh for the Seder itself. Okay? Cleaning, the packet that I just linked you to can give you some hints as to how to clean, especially the kitchen, which items can practically be made kosher for Passover and which can't. Cheeses, cheese and wines are sort of interesting, but in general having to do with kashrut, but we're going to talk about kashrut in another session. So that sort of sets the scene. I want to keep moving along because I want to talk about the Seder. And, you talk about that 15-minute Seder, that's exactly how much time I have. So if you have specific questions about details, we can discuss that at some point, offline. But if you have things that have to do with a beginner's class, we can, if it's a very important question, then absolutely shoot it my way. Okay, So the Seder, as I said, recharges our batteries, recharges our Jewish batteries. That's the Seder means order. So in a sense, what we're trying to do, that is the meal, by the way, the first night of Passover, how the holiday begins, and the second night for those who are traditional, meaning and diaspora, meaning that we add that second day because we're not sure when the new moon began and all of that. But actually having two Seders, I mean, I shouldn't say this because I don't do most of the work, but it's kind of nice to be able to, have different opportunities to experience the holiday in different ways with different people. All right, so recharging the batteries for sure, a sense of order, reorganizing our lives, Passover, spring cleaning, that whole organization thing, the flattening of the leaven in our lives, that's true. But the word Seder does mean order, and so it actually presents us with an order. As we make this journey from the chaos of our lives, we come back to the family and we have a sense of order. So there are a number of steps to the Seder, and we're going to look at them here. Okay, so we don't need this, and we want to go back to this. So first of all, before I talk about the steps, let's talk about the symbols that you find at a Seder table. There's a plate. Now, remember last week when I talked about the destruction of the Second Temple, how the rabbis needed to find a way to keep the memory of the temple alive, and to channel that grief, because they felt grief hundreds of years later, and certainly within the shadow of the still smoldering stones of the temple in Jerusalem, and the most active time of year, with the possible exception of Sukkot, was Passover, when the Paschal sacrifice was brought. So they had to find a way to keep that memory alive, to create a new sense of order, of Seder, and at the same time, to go away from this notion of sacrifices, this notion of killing animals, and find a way to memorialize it properly. So the Seder plate helps us to do that, with items like the shank bone, representing the Pesach, the special lamb sacrifice made in the days of the Passover holiday, and matzah, of course, bitter herbs to remember slavery as well. And also it's one of the commandments in the book of Exodus having to do with Passover observance in temple times. It was brought to the table. And then we've added, and here's the beauty of this holiday, it is constantly evolving, we've added other symbols. So the orange is mentioned here for LGBTQ and gender equality, the artichoke heart for inclusion of interfaith families, fair trade chocolate, tomatoes, olives for peace in the Middle East, cashews, bananas, pine cones. You can look at all different ways to make your Seder special and significant to you. And these are all totally legitimate. There are 4,000, last count, versions of the Haggadah. What does the word Haggadah mean? It means telling. So the Passover story, which is really not so much the Exodus from Egypt, it's not so much about Moses. Moses is hardly mentioned at all, but it's more about how to tell the story, and it's more about the Jewish people and our journey since the Exodus from Egypt, and the journey from slavery to freedom, which is also a journey from degradation, from all kinds of degradation, not just slavery, but idol worship, for instance, in the days of Abraham, to freedom in different senses. So anyway, the Haggadah tells that story in different ways. 4,000 of them. If you go, and I hope you can see this, this is a wonderful website. Very simple, haggadot.com. And you go there, and you can find a whole bunch of different Haggadahs that you will be able to use at your Seders. So, for instance, the ChatGPT Haggadah supplement. I sent a little excerpt from that out today. Fascinating. I'm not so, thrilled with ChatGPT. Right? I don't think it should be taking over our Seders. In fact, you could have a discussion about it at your Seder, whether artificial intelligence is the antithesis of the freedom that we're celebrating. That could be interesting. The 10-minute Dayenu Seder, the minimalist Haggadah. There's never a maximalist Haggadah. I never see that. Honoring the people of Ukraine. The Schitt's Creek Haggadah. The Golden Girls Haggadah, Passover Meditation Guide, Women's Seder. And these are all, you can sort of pick and choose. And here's one based on focusing on world hunger, another on Sephardic and Mizrahi practices. We've come a long way since the Maxwell House Seder, I have to say. But some of you just want the Maxwell House Seder. I understand, and we'll hear all about it. The highest Haggadah, which focuses on Jewish refugees. So the whole Haggadah is seen through these different lenses, and Black Lives Matter, a feminist one called The Revenge of Dinah. Look through these. Take the website. Maybe I'll throw this out to you in the chat, and go to town. So. All right, let me continue. I'm going to go through 5 minutes for the rest of the Seder, and I really do want to end on time here because I'm really excited about what we're going to hear. So anyway, the 15 steps. By the way, I was talking about how it recalls the temple worship. There were 15 steps up to the altar at the temple in Jerusalem. The Levites would sing from these steps. So the Seder steps somewhat evoke that. All right, so I'll just I'm very visual, so I think you need to see these steps. First of all, one of the symbols on the Seder plate is charoset, and here's an example of how you can take a simple symbol and reach out to the Jewish world and find, celebrate, revel in our diversity. So here are charosets of the world. I'll be happy to send you that link if you want. All right, so again, I want to be visual here. Kadesh, the wine, Kiddush. Orachatz, we wash hands without a blessing. Karpas, dip a vegetable in salt water. And that also is a great opportunity just to eat before the meal. You're saying a blessing. You can have a vegetable. Last I heard, a potato chip is a vegetable of sorts. And so some kids would have parched grains in some cultures. And of course, it also, if you're passing around a vegetable and dipping it in salt water, kids are going to ask questions, which is the main purpose of the Seder. One of the main purposes are to get people to ask questions. I want to talk for a second about Kadesh, about the wine and the matzah. The middle matzah is broken in yachatz, the next part, because one of the great dramas of the Passover Seder is this drama between the matzah and the wine, this interplay. They are the stars of the table, the great protagonists, because I talked about the Seder being a way to focus on organizing our lives, stability. There's nothing more stable and organized and ordered than matzah. Matzah, you can put in a time capsule, and 30 years from now, you can open it, and it will taste as fresh as it tasted when you put it in the time capsule. It's actually sort of fascinating because it starts out stale, but because it doesn't change. Yes, it gets crummy. Yes, it gets all over the place, but that also is a way that it sort of intrudes itself on our lives. If you take it to school or to work, people are going to ask about it. And generally speaking, those who don't have to eat it for 8 days like it. So I sort of like it too. But anyway, that stability of matzah is very important. It doesn't change. You can do time-lapse photography at any Seder table with any family. And, let's not say 30 years, let's say 50 years, 100 years, 1,000 years, and you will see what's in the middle of the table, the matzah, staying exactly the same. Some of the things surrounding it might change, shank bone might be a beet or something like that. But and of course, you might add an orange and some of the things I mentioned before. But the matzah is the same. The Haggadah, although it is embellished, has similar core elements. The wine, on the other hand, is all about flux, literally flow, fermentation, which is the thing on Passover that's sort of the enemy of matzah. But the wine does that, except Manischewitz, which never tastes fermented, but I don't know. So you have stability and flux. And you'll notice at your seders, the way the drama is orchestrated, you cover one while you lift the other. You lift one, you drink one, you cover the other. You fill the wine cup at a certain time. You know, it's always about like not embarrassing the matzah in front of the wine and vice versa. And by the way, with the question of time-lapse photography, what also changes is the people sitting around the table. Us and our ancestors and our descendants. And we can just, if we can mute ourselves as we come aboard, just a reminder to everybody. Okay, so, you know, I sat by my father's side. Back in those days, we're very traditional. He led the Seder, and I was like, you know, his favorite. What can I say? Actually, my sister was on the other side. She was also his favorite. And then as years go by, of course, people leave, sadly, but others take their place at the center. Others take their place at the high chair on the end, and we move around the table. So, you know, just as we talk about the cycles of time, some things stay exactly the same and consistent, and some things flow. But that's why the Seder is so powerful. It connects us to a people that has lived for thousands of years, but also to our own families and ultimately to ourselves. So then we have the story of Passover, the Magid section, and that comes next. And of course, the Magid section has all kinds of things that are part of it, but it's telling the story in different ways, and I'm not going to get into great detail. It's not necessary here. But you can see we then move to washing our hands, to preparing for the meal, which starts with the motzi, the Thanksgiving prayer over the matzah. Then we combine it with the maror. One motif of the holiday is the mixing of the bitter and the sweet. And the mixing of slavery and freedom, the journey from slavery to freedom. So we have that mixing taking place with this first ever sandwich involving maror and charoset, that sweet mixture that is reminiscent of the mortar for the bricks used by slaves. And then the meal, and then the stuff after the meal, which, you know, is worth doing a little singing, Hallel, and then those great songs at the end, including the One Little Goat, that is, for so long, the end of the Seder. What I have here, which we're not going to get into again, is different variations of some of the key moments of the Seder, like the 4 sons became the 4 children, and here is the 4 daughters. And anyway, you got a lot going on with the Seder. So I'm just going to ask quickly, and if anyone has any questions sort of a general nature, please let me know. Okay, I think we're good. This was a lot of fun, and you know what? I actually managed to get us in 46 minutes. You will never find a Seder that will accomplish getting it down to the minute. I'm very, very proud, I have to say. So I believe our guest is aboard. Are you here? Michael, you here? If you are, you can unmute yourself. Michael Feldstein has done this lecture and has received rave reviews, but he's a friend of so many in our community, and I am just delighted to have you here, Michael. And I promised I wouldn't tire everyone out and leave them aching for more. So take it away. By the way, we are recording. I hope that's okay with you.
Not a problem.
Okay.
Can everyone hear me?
All yours.
Okay, first I just wanted to thank you, Rabbi Hammerman, for allowing me to teach this course. And it's a fun little presentation, and I hope you'll all enjoy it. I did have a couple of sheets which I sent to you. Were you able to get those, Rabbi Hammerman, and can you share those?
Okay, I just made you a co-host, but let me look for it. I have to say I didn't catch.
I think I still have it. Hold on. It'll just take, quickly. I just wanted to all right, so I have to share my screen now, so. See if I can do
All right,
this.
if you I do have it.
Oh, okay.
If
So maybe you can share it.
Yeah, I will do that. Which one do you want?
Maxwell House 1, the first page, and then I'll go to the second page.
Okay, will do.
Okay, it's not all that clear, but these are the first couple of Haggadahs that Maxwell House came out with, going back to 1932. That's the one on the left. The one in the middle is 1933. 1955 is the one on the right. You see that there's very little change from 1932 to 1955. In 1960, there was a new edition. This is the one that I remember as a kid. Had a very bright blue cover. You probably remember it if you're in my demographic. And that lasted for quite a while. They also included a 5-year calendar which showed the dates that the Hebrew holidays came out on the English calendar, which was kind of fun. And then if you go to the second page, Rabbi Hammerman, I'll just show you a quick couple of photos there.
Right. Hold on one second. Here we go.
Okay, that's just kind of a sampling of all the different Haggadahs going from the beginning to the end. And again, it's not as clear as it should be. I picked this up from the internet.
I think I did.
Then there's a really neat one in the middle. That's the original ad for the kosher for Pesach coffee that Maxwell House came out with. And I'll tell you the story about that in my presentation. And finally, at the bottom, you'll see a couple of interesting photos, a photo of the Maxwell House Haggadah being used by President Obama at his Pesach Seder in the White House. And then to the right, you'll see some military folks who are, again, using the Pesach Haggadah, and I will get into that as well. So we can stop the share, and I'll go right into the presentation now. So it's traditional to ask questions at the Seder on Pesach. The youngest child, of course, asks the Manishtana, inquiring why this night is different from all other nights. The wise son, the wicked son, and the simple son all ask questions. And then there are some of the questions that many American Jews ask, like, why did Maxwell House produce a Haggadah? And what does a Haggadah have to do with coffee and with Maxwell House in particular? And when did this all begin? And what's that weird looking stain on the page with Dayenu? Unlike the questions at the Seder, which mainly have open-ended answers and really are meant to stimulate discussion, the Maxwell House Haggadah questions actually do have some very well-defined answers. The Maxwell House Haggadah is an English Hebrew Pesach Haggadah. I'm sure most of you are familiar with it. It was introduced by the company in 1932 as a marketing promotion. And except for a couple of years during World War II, when there was a paper shortage, it has been printed continuously every year since that time. More than 55 million copies have been printed and distributed, making it the best known and most popular Haggadah among American Jews. It's become a cultural icon. It's used in homes, in schools, in senior citizen centers, in prisons, in the US Armed Forces, and was even used, as I said, by President Obama and his guests at the annual White House Seder from 2009 to 2016. And the Maxwell House Haggadah owes its existence to a man named Joseph Jacobs. He was the former advertising manager for the Yiddish paper, The Forward. And in 1919, Jacobs founded the Joseph Jacobs Advertising Agency, which specialized in selling ads for Jewish publications. And in 1923, Jacobs convinced Maxwell House Coffee, which was then owned by Chick Neal Coffee Company, to invest in an advertising campaign that would specifically target Jewish consumers. But here, there was a problem. Until that time, the coffee bean had been considered by many as a legume, which meant it was kitniot and not kosher for Pesach, at least for Ashkenazic Jews. Jewish grocery store owners would actually put away their coffee along with their other chametz under the incorrect assumption that they were kitniot. But in fact, the coffee bean is a fruit, not a bean, and it's perfectly permissible to eat and drink coffee on Pesach. So what Jacobs did is he contacted a rabbi in the Lower East Side, and he was able to get him to certify that coffee was indeed kosher LePesach. And to drive that point home, he placed ads in the forward announcing to all Yiddish speakers that Maxwell House Coffee was indeed kosher for Passover. So about 10 years later, Jacobs was able to convince Maxwell House that it would be in their best interests to produce an English Hebrew version of the Haggadah and actually give them away free to consumers at supermarkets in an attempt to win their loyalty. And they really were given away free, which might explain why your great aunt Betty still has 17 of them. The goal, of course, was to infuse the brand with the holiday. And boy, did it work well. Ellie Rosenfeld, who is the current CEO of the Joseph Jacobs Advertising Agency, yes, that agency still exists so many years later, said the following, and this is a quote: "This wasn't a cultural thing, this was business. The sales for Maxwell House Coffee always spikes a month before Passover." Rosenfeld said, "It gets recognition, it builds the brand, and at this point, it's a cherished part of the tradition and the heritage of the brand. And it's something that still resonates with consumers even today." Now, Maxwell House annually distributes over 1 million Haggadahs every year, and it easily is the biggest selling Haggadah of all time, as I said. The question is, why did it become so popular, and why has it become such a part of the American Jewish experience? And I think there are 3 reasons. The first reason is that there was a tremendous interest in the Pesach Seder among American Jews, and it really required some sort of script to play out the whole drama. And the Maxwell House Haggadah was there to fill that need, especially for those who had little familiarity with religious observance. It was really the right product produced at the right time. Remember, until this time, the Seder was largely based on traditions passed down within the community. Local custom always ruled over liturgy. Ironically, it was really the Maxwell House company which did more to codify Jewish liturgy than any other force in history, rabbis and Jewish institutions included. And that's no slight to you, Rabbi Hammerman, but Maxwell House, in my opinion, did more to codify Jewish liturgy than any other rabbi or other Jewish institution in history. Second, it was easily available. All it took was a trip to the local supermarket. It was lightweight, it was small enough for a child to hold, easy to store. So that made it very popular as well. And finally, I think the layout and the text was very user-friendly for a generation of largely assimilated Jews in America. Their Hebrew or the Yiddish was not quite up to snuff, and it provided the first truly American script for the Seder, for those who had assimilated. And the Maxwell House Haggadah became the gold standard because it provided an inexpensive way to provide, a dozen or even 24 guests with the same Haggadah, with the same Hebrew and English text. Everyone could read off the same page, and it was very user-friendly. Now, I'm a marketing guy, and in marketing, we often talk about a company offering branded content to the consumer. What does that mean? I think the Maxwell House Haggadah is really the best example of a company that was offering a successful branded content promotion to help sell its product. And why did it do so well? And I think it did well because branded content has to serve some sort of consumer need. And Maxwell House knew that Jewish families spend time around the Seder table, and they produced content that actually filled that need. It also has to add value. And with multiple copies of the same Haggadah, Maxwell House was, they made it easier for families and friends to come together and use one single text. And the final thing is branded content should also be organic, not intrusive. The beauty of the Maxwell House Haggadah is that the advertising was not in your face like a lot of advertising is. Besides the cover and a little, mention in the introduction, the Maxwell House brand took a back seat to the Haggadah's text, and it did not interfere with it. It's known as the Maxwell House Haggadah, but it wasn't like Maxwell House name and coffee visuals were plastered all over the Haggadah. It was really the content that was king. And it also allowed communities to establish new rituals. For many Jews, a yearly pilgrimage to the supermarket to pick up additional copies is entrenched in our psyche as purchasing Manischewitz wine and Streit's matzah. Now, going back to the original edition, it actually gave equal prominence to the Hebrew text and the English translation. It had them on the same page, placing them in parallel columns on the same page. But it also conveyed authenticity and an adherence to tradition by opening from right to left in the manner of all other Hebrew books. The instructions for conducting the Seder appeared on the English side only, and references to biblical verses cited in the text were on the Hebrew side. There was no commentary or exegesis as you see in like Art Scroll Haggadahs and other current Haggadahs. It was really just the text and the translation. The original translation was very old-fashioned, had a lot of these and thous and all masculine language for God and gender-specific references for a male reader. There were some limited illustrations spliced through the Haggadah. Some of them were originally from the 1695 Amsterdam Haggadah, which was reproduced in this one. As I mentioned, the first edition also contained an abridged 5-year calendar, which lists all of the secular dates for all the Jewish holidays from 1932 until 1936. You can see that. You saw that in the page that I showed you at first. And this version, the original version, actually lasted for 28 years with only very minor changes to the text and the covers. I did a little research trying to find out who the person was who did the original English translation to the Maxwell House Haggadah. And it's not noted in the Haggadah itself, and there's no record in the company's archives. And I couldn't find who did it. And I even called Jonathan Sarna, who's probably the most well-known American historian, Jewish American historian, teaches at Brandeis. I sent him an email and I asked him if he knew. He didn't know either. So it's one of those mysteries that I guess we'll never know, even though we're really only talking, less than 100 years. So in 1960, that was the big change to the Haggadah. There was a deluxe edition of the Maxwell House Haggadah that was introduced. This is the one with the bright blue cover and the circular image design that a lot of us are familiar with from our youth. The biggest change here was that there was the inclusion of an Ashkenazic transliteration for those who couldn't read the Hebrew text, but who wanted to recite the Haggadah in Hebrew. So this edition included the transliterated text of the Hebrew and allowed people who did not know how to read Hebrew to actually say the Haggadah in Hebrew. The English translation was also modernized. It had a nicer typeface, and it was just spruced up a bit. There's an interesting story. In 1990, there was an error in the order of the service that was finally corrected. In the original Maxwell House Haggadah from 1932 until 1990, a long time. Lishana Haba'a B'Yerushalayim appeared before the fourth cup of wine, and it was moved to the end of the Haggadah where it belongs, and that was corrected in 1990. 1998, there was a big change also. The art and the type were reset once again, but the basic translation and design remained basically intact. The biggest change actually happened only a little over 10 years ago, in 2011. There was a brand new English translation that was introduced, and it replaced the archaic phrases in the original, and it incorporated some politically correct gender-neutral language. So all of the these and the thous and the wherefores and the saiths were removed, and they were replaced with you, why, and say instead of the old-fashioned terms. Instead of referring to God as a king, it used the word monarch, and instead of the word father, it used parent. So again, it became much more politically correct. You won't find mention of the 4 sons in the new translation. Instead, the Haggadah speaks of the 4 different sorts of children. The translation was done by a man named Henry Frisch. He's a high school English teacher. He lives in Teaneck, New Jersey. The traditional Hebrew text was left unchanged. In terms of the design and the type, the English was placed on the opposite page of the Hebrew, like our Sidurim. So instead of the same page, including both the Hebrew and the English translation, it was on separate pages, similar to the way some of our Sidurim are positioned. Many of the changes that were made in the translation are simply common sense alterations. For example, instead of unleavened bread, the new translation simply uses the transliterated word matzah. The third plague in the original Maxwell House Haggadah originally was called vermin, which I think is a term that nobody uses now. It's now referred to as lice, which is a better translation. For the Ma'anesh Tana, the old version of the Haggadah said, "Wherefore is this night distinguished from all other nights?" And the new Maxwell House translation puts it much more simply and more familiarly. Why is this night different from all other nights? Which is the way that I think we usually refer to the first beginning of the Ma'anesh Tana. The She'eno Yodea Yish'ol has been translated as hath no capacity to inquire. That's the way it was, and it's now translated to who does not know how to inquire. So again, a lot of stuff that was just cleaned up, from a language standpoint. Some of the stuff was just not politically correct, and the new edition definitely corrects those passages. Ellie Rosenfeld, the CEO of the Joseph Jacobs Advertising Agency, said about the old version, "What 7-year-old is going to be able to read the Ma'anesh Tana in English and understand what they're asking?" I mean, it really was a strange translation. The new translation is much more modernized and again, politically correct. There were some other egalitarian and politically correct changes made to the illustrations too. The prior editions had a graphic of a man's hand breaking the matzah in half next to yachatz, and the new edition, there's just an illustration of a gender-free matzah broken in half with 2 lonely crumbs between the halves. No man, no woman. It's neutral. The graphic for the 4 questions had been a father stroking his chin and listening to one of his 2 sons recite the questions. A light-haired daughter just kind of looked on from the side. And the new version shows a photo of a young, well-dressed girl holding her Haggadah as she prepares to recite the questions. you've certainly come a long way, baby. I don't know if those who remember the Haggadah, the old-time woodcut graphic of the 10 plagues. That was something that always intrigued me. It was complete with a drawing of a dead cow. I was always fascinated by that as a kid. Now it just shows a couple of frogs. So they got rid of the dead cow. They just have some frogs now. Jeffrey Gurak, who's an American Jewish history professor at Yeshiva University, felt that the updated text is a testament to the capitalistic aspect behind this particular Haggadah. So rather than trying to fight tradition, the Haggadah's new translation reflects an ongoing sensitivity to the consumer and a desire to please. After all, it's about selling coffee too. It's really, the Maxwell House Haggadah is really a cultural icon. I mean, American Jews who remember using the Maxwell House Haggadah in their homes when they were children really consider it a tradition, and many continue to use it at their own Passover Seders now. In 1997, the Hallmark Company actually reproduced the familiar blue cover of the Maxwell House Haggadah on one of its Passover greeting cards, describing the Haggadah as a prized family possession that have been handed down through the generations and is a warm reminder of the past. Another example of how iconic the Maxwell House Haggadah is, in 2015, the 92nd Street Y launched a special retro Seder program called Manischewitz, Maxwell House, and Memories. Wanted to create a nostalgic feel, and they served Manischewitz wine, they served Mrs. Adler's gefilte fish, they served some chopped liver, and the Haggadah that was used, of course, it was the Maxwell House Haggadah. Professor Gurak emphasizes that the Maxwell House Haggadah is as much a consumer story as it is a Jewish one. This is a quote from Gurak. This Haggadah might be the best example of the melding of American entrepreneurship and Jewish tradition. That's what my parents and grandparents used, even though it was a consumer product put out by a non-Jewish company. William Helmreich, a professor of sociology at the City University of New York, said that over the years he has acquired many family Haggadahs and fancy Haggadahs filled with exegesis and commentary that could stretch a Seder for 4 hours. But the one he prefers still is the Maxwell House Haggadah because, in his words, it is suffused with tradition. Said Helmreich, it is the Haggadah that I used when I was growing up, and it's still around. It reminds me that the essence and the beauty of the story lies in its simplicity. The average person cannot get through the flood of information in the fancy Haggadahs because people want to eat and the kids are restless. The other amazing thing about the Maxwell House Haggadah is that while it has always kept the consumer in mind, it is still a traditional Haggadah with no changes made to the original Hebrew text. Today, there often is a tendency to try to, shoot for relevance, and in making that effort, we often end up pandering, which can become a real problem. And the Maxwell House Haggadah maintained its authenticity, which no doubt contributed to its success, in my opinion. And while it seems a little odd today that Haggadah bears the name of a commercial concern, back in the 1930s, it was exciting that a big corporate entity like Maxwell House that was owned by a non-Jewish family actually put its name on a Haggadah. That was a remarkable, remarkable story in and of itself. Some other interesting facts that the Maxwell House Haggadah, about the Maxwell House Haggadah. As I said, it's the most widely used Haggadah in the world. There are actually 10,000 people who get mailed the Haggadah every year, and they pay a nominal shipping charge. So it is given away free at the supermarkets, but there are some people who, I guess, for whatever reason, can't get to a supermarket or like the idea of having it shipped to them. 10,000 people. The U.S. Army has issued it to its soldiers in every military campaign since the 1930s. They're printed in Chicago and shipped out from there. Interestingly enough, this was not the first attempt to issue a Haggadah in English translation. In fact, in 1929, 3 years before the Maxwell House Haggadah was first issued, Yeshivat Chaim Berlin, which was an Orthodox yeshiva, sponsored one as a token of gratitude to its donors. But interestingly, it never got, it never circulated again. It was given away as just a gift to its donors. Interesting story. I mean, the yeshiva of Chaim Berlin is certainly not known as a Zionist supporter of Israel, but the original Haggadah had a Zionist flag in it, and all of the teachers and the rabbis that are depicted in the Haggadah don't have beards. So it definitely was a different time for Orthodox Jewry in 1929. Then finally, there are many stories about Russian immigrants to America who didn't speak a word of English, but they had copies of the Maxwell House Haggadah, which had been smuggled into Russia during the period when Jews were still in Russia, and a lot of Americans would try to, get Jewish articles to the Russians who needed them at the time. So when they were finally released and freed, they took their Maxwell House Haggadahs with them, which is an interesting story in itself. In closing, I just wanted to share one very humorous story, which apparently really happened. A few years ago, Jeffrey Goldberg and Jonathan Safran, they wrote a commentary for a Haggadah called The New American Haggadah. It was one of the new Haggadahs that was published in a few years ago. And there were an impressive list of Jewish intellectuals who contributed to the Haggadah. And shortly after it was published, Goldberg, who is a writer for the Atlantic magazine, was interviewing President Obama. And when he was finished with the interview, he told Obama that he had a book he wanted to show him. And the book that he wanted to show him was the book that he had just published, The New American Haggadah. And President Obama looked at the Haggadah and said to Goldberg, "Does this mean we can't use the Maxwell House Haggadah at our Seder anymore?" Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions. I see there may be some things in the chat that I'll look at now, but it's an interesting story. It's an interesting history, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation.
We did. It was wonderful. Thank you. And yes, put questions into the chat if you have any.
Quinoa is most rabbis would accept quinoa as something that you can eat, that it's not considered a grain. Someone asked.
Right, it's sort of like a fruit.
Yeah, I don't know what the technical, but I think even the Orthodox Union, the OU, has said that quinoa is okay to eat on Pesach.
It's a fruit. A bunch of rabbis went to the mountain.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Exactly. Barton's candy. Yeah, I remember Barton's candy. Waldbaum, Streitz. Those are icons also. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting history.
So one thing
Does anybody still have their Maxwell House Haggadah? And does anybody use it? Yeah, we got a few hands up.
Yeah, we have it. Sverdlov Pavlov group has it.
I have a bunch from my mother.
Yeah, the original. Yeah, there you go. It's much more colorful now. It's interesting. The original translations really were dense, so I'm glad they did clean that up. I think they did a much better job in the new translation. Just another point of information. I mentioned that the Maxwell House Haggadah has been used by the military for, ever since it was published. Before that, okay, and again, we're talking about before 1932, so, World War I, and, anybody who was in the armed forces before 1932, the JWB, the Jewish Welfare Board, distributed a very simple Haggadah that they sent to the Jewish, there you go. There's a couple
This is it from 1952.
Yeah, and the JWB distributed some Haggadahs to the Jewish servicemen before 1932. So there was, again, it was, not a terribly.
We're going to have a commercial here. Ronnie, go ahead.
This is my daughter's Haggadah, the Kvela Haggadah, a Seder for curious kids and their grown-ups. So this is the second edition. So I just had to do a little bragging.
You're the first one to kvel about Kveller. And tell Gabby we're really proud of her. So yeah, the Kveller Haggadah, Maxwell House is fine, but everyone get the Kveller Haggadah, especially with kids. But so how do we deal with, kids are amazingly resilient, but it's not a matter of, what one would call politically correct or anything like that at this point. To have the death of the firstborn as a featured moment of the Seder, you can get around the frogs by sort of throwing them around and making them cute. Death of the firstborn is hard to deal with. How does Maxwell House deal with it, and have they changed over time?
I'm not exactly sure if they reference anything except just translating it that way. Again, it's not like there's a lot of commentary in the Maxwell House Haggadah.
Right, and there aren't a lot of pictures either.
Yeah, and in terms of the plagues, I think the only picture now is the frogs. There used to be pictures of all the different plagues.
The red cow.
Yeah. Yeah, that would be a tough one to illustrate, and you're right, it is very tough to explain to youngsters.
The whole story, it's really a difficult story. It's not as bad as Purim, but it's hard, and the whole idea is to get the kids involved. Yep. So we have to deal with that without traumatizing them.
Yeah, no question. It's difficult. Hopefully there's some other positive stories that they can look at and feel good about.
Beverly Kesbach talked about the wine stains, which I think are an important feature of any Haggadah, but especially the ones that have been in the family for so many years.
Yeah,
they each have their own little archaeological dig, that you can. Uncle Joe did that when he got a little tipsy after the fourth cup.
It gives the Haggadah a little more authenticity, absolutely, and it always seems to be at the spot of Kiddush or the point where you spill the wine at the plagues. That's where the wine stains are.
Sandy wanted to know what catalyzed your interest in the Maxwell House Haggadah. What got you into this?
I'm generally very interested in 20th century American history, and this is one of actually many presentations I've done on 20th century Jewish history. Hopefully I can do some more in the future if there's interest. I on the one hand, the 20th century, and compared to the thousands of years of Jewish history, the 20th century is really very new, and it's hard to even consider it history. But in my mind, it's something that I can relate to a little bit more because, many of the things happened, at least if not in my generation, in my parents' or my grandparents' generation. And it's just a way of kind of connecting a little bit more. So, this is one of the things that I think was, an iconic moment in Jewish history in America.
One thing that, I want to suggest is that it's not an either or situation. You can use the Maxwell House Haggadah, especially if you have a Seder with 50 people at it and you don't want to buy 50 Haggadahs, but then use these others these incredible commentaries, some of them as resources. You can even pass them around the table.
Right.
And the New American, I think it's called the New American Haggadah. That's Jonathan Safran Foer, by the way, and Nathan.
Yeah, that's the one I referred to.
Right, Nathan Englander was the other co-author, of course, the novelist. And but Jeffrey Goldberg interviewed Obama. I know that came out in his interview. But anyway, the commentaries are so different and fascinating. That way you can have a little of each. You have the tradition, but you also have a chance to make the Seder fresh.
Right. It's good idea. And of course, for many of us who celebrate two Seders, you can use the Maxwell House for one, and maybe another Haggadah for the second one.
So Bill tells us that quinoa is a seed, not a fruit.
A seed, okay.
Not a grain.
The key is that it's not a grain. So
it's a grass. Oh no, grains are grass. So okay, here we go. Passover makes us learn these things and makes us more mindful of our food. That in and of itself, makes this whole search for chametz important and interesting. We have to look at labels. I wouldn't just trust kasher lePesach. I would look at the label and really find out what we're eating. Beverly, we do use several Haggadahs. Our Seders are pretty long and wonderful. I'm sure they are, especially if you and Alan are leading them. All right, who else?
May I say something?
Yes.
Years ago, I went to some Jewish store in New Rochelle, and I looked at 20 different kinds of Haggadahs because I wanted a more modern one, and I didn't like them at all. So we always use the Maxwell House one. We only have one of the newest ones, but if I'm reading it, I change the words, to God instead of the most holy one or whatever. But I'm going to go to the store and try to get a lot of the new ones.
Good for
And
you.
you can get them online too. I showed you that link. I showed the class earlier, and you can look at the the video later.
Okay. Thank you.
Really, there are so many resources online that are free that can supplement what you're using.
Yep, absolutely. Anyway, I wish everyone a happy Passover, a Chag Kasher V'Sameach, and whatever Haggadah you happen to use. I hope it'll be a meaningful holiday for you and your family, and I look forward to seeing you all again, maybe at another presentation.
Michael, and I want to thank you, and not just for this, which was amazing, but also everything you do for our community. And you're a real friend of so many, and definitely a friend of Temple Bethel. So thank you so much.
I appreciate that, Rabbi Hammerman, and good luck to you in the next chapter of your life.
Okay, I'm going to take that out of the video.
Yeah.
No, just kidding. Anyway, thank you very much, and yes, great presentation. Thank you. And
Okay.
Everyone, a Zisen sweet Passover. Take care. Bye.
Take care.
Yeah, bye-bye.